So in this next topic, what we're going to look at is promotional analytics or marketing analytics, right? So we include that in this class. It was initially developed by some marketing faculty. This class had a heavy influence by marketing because marketing uses a lot of analytics. And so they wanted to introduce it in this class. But two things. Number one, this is not a marketing class, and I am not a marketing person. I'm actually an economist, right? And so I can go through this stuff, but it's not a marketing class. And so I want to very, very briefly touch on this stuff. We're going to introduce some of it. What I do want to spend a fair amount of time on in this topic is the process of linear optimization, which is a way to do promotional analytics or marketing analytics. But it also has applications outside of just marketing. And so I think that's the role of including this material in a class like this, is just primarily as an introduction and overview and showing of the methods. And so I am not going to read all this, but in general, you can glance through these different promotional methods. And my first question is going to be just general. Do you have any questions about what any of these represent? I think they're all pretty straightforward, but I want to make sure that you're given an opportunity to ask. If any are not clear what they mean, that I can give you feedback on what they do represent. And so again, this is not a marketing class, but as we look at these different methods, you can imagine where the use of these different types of promotional methods may have changed over time, and it also may be different across industries, that some industries, some products, some goods and services might be much more amenable to certain types of advertising, and other products may not be amenable to these. So I think about the radio advertisements, and so I'm thinking about like the Spotify or the Pandora. If you don't have the paid version, you get all these free advertisements. Think about the demographics that are going to be using that, right? That's a little bit different than print advertising, like in magazines or newspapers, right? That's a very different demographic than some internet-based stuff. And so again, right, you just the only thing that we need to say in this class is, right, these different promotional activities, they may be a function of the product that you're selling and the time that you're selling in, and in general, right, you want to be aware of it. When a company is thinking about doing their promotion, and I'm using the term promotion and marketing interchangeable because I'm an economist. When you take your marketing class, there's definitely you can get into more fine-grained detail of the details of marketing, but for this class, we're just going to use some very, very high-level terms, and so I'm going to use promotion and marketing interchangeable. You come up with a budget, though, right? So this is a big part of it. You want to come up with a certain amount of money that can be devoted to promotional activities, and all that this is saying is that there are different ways that a company can develop their promotional budget, right? If you do percentage of sales, right, then I think that's pretty straightforward, but you simply look at your sales and you always want a certain percentage of your sales to be devoted to promotional activities, right? And so you can think about the pros and cons of a method like this. If your sales were to grow by default, by definition, the value or the total dollar amount of your promotional budget would also change, but the percentage would stay constant, right? Sometimes that may be appropriate, sometimes it's not. You can also think about an affordable promotional budget. As its name implies, an affordable promotional budget strategy, a promotional budget strategy is just simply trying to figure out what can your company afford, and then that's the way to set the budget, right? Competitive parity, right, is a method where you just simply look around at your competition and you try to figure out how much they're spending on their promotional activities, on their promotional budget, and you meet that, right? Parity, we are meeting that amount. And again, just it's benchmarking your promotional budget based on what your competition is doing. But I'm going to step back and ask, the question, right? What if your competition is spending too much on promotional activities? If you go with a competitive parity strategy for doing your promotional budget, you're also going to be making a bad choice, right? And so this might be an easy one to do, but it might be an incorrect one to do. And then objective and task. As its name implies, the objective and task promotional budget strategy is just very much designing a budget, specifically thinking about specific tasks that need to be accomplished and asking, in order to accomplish those specific things, how much money is it going to cost? All of those are different promotional budget strategies. Great. What we're going to focus on in this last one is a model-based, right? So in a model-based promotional budget strategy, right, to oversimplify it a little bit, but basically what you do is you may have a couple of different promotional strategies that you could undertake. And again, we can go back to this previous story where we've got a bunch of different things that we could do as promotional activities, and we think about how effective each of those are, right? We can think about how effective some of those are, but they also have different dollar amounts associated with it. And this is why, as an economist, I'm drawn to this, because it's basically trying to write out a mathematical model to understand how much promotion activity is going to happen, what the impact on your sales is going to be, and then the different costs of those, and figuring out what's the optimal or most efficient way of doing it, right? It's very much an optimization problem. And that's why we wrap it into this analytics class. And so primarily, that's what we're going to focus on. Again, objective and task. I'm not going to say very much about this, but this is, again, one of the strategies. And I'll just ask the very general question again. Take a second, read through this information. Is it relatively straightforward, or do you have any clarifying questions on what any of this terminology means, recognizing that this is not going to be a big source of what you're asked on? Before we really get into the nuts and bolts of the optimization problem, we just want to talk about an advertising share response function. Again, this is one of the more quantitative courses in a business curriculum, and so we just want to introduce the concept here, right? So what we've got here is we've got different amounts of advertising and different market share, with the idea that a firm can increase, they can choose the amount of advertising that they do. They can increase the amount of advertising that they do. And overall, right, what's the pattern? That as they increase the amount of advertising, their market share is going to increase, but not at a linear trend, right? This is assuming this S-shaped advertising share response function. And so again, if you're going to go on with marketing, you may see this in some of your upper level classes, but we just wanted to talk about some of the main points of it here. Again, if we've got this nice little S-shaped response function, then you can think about a company who is right here doing this level of advertising. What are they trying to do here? They're trying to maintain their market share, right? So implicit in what this model is that, A, if you do absolutely no advertising whatsoever, it's not that you're going to completely be eliminated. There is going to be, you're still going to maintain some level of market share, but that if you do advertising that's less than the maintenance level, it's going to cut into your market share, right? In order to maintain your market share, you're going to have to continue doing some amount of advertising. And again, all of that costs money. And then one of the, from what I've been told, because I'm not a marketing person, but from what I've been told by my marketing colleagues, is that one of the ways that these response functions gets used is the thought of, okay, if we want to boost our advertising by 20%, what the advertising response function tells you is how much your market share is going to change by. And again, you can think about if you had a firm that was at point A versus a firm that was at point B versus a firm that was at point C versus, we can even do this point up here, point D, if each of those times you boosted your advertising by 20%, there's going to be a different impact on market share based on where you were on the existing response function, right? And so again, just some terminology. Notice that if you keep doing more and more and more advertising, what happens, right? Your market share, there's a maximum limit to it, right? Advertising can only do so much. There is this natural ceiling to it. And so again, you can think about how two ways, either through time, how this advertising share response function for your company or your industry might change through time, but you can also think about across products, right? And so you can think about if you're not going to be working for one single company, but instead you're working for a firm that has multiple clients, you can think about across your clients, across those different products, the response function might look different across different products. And so that might imply some different things about a 20% boost in your advertising efforts. Okay, nuts and bolts. We're going to consider the following promotional model. So real quick, right? We've got a firm, and what that firm is trying to do is they are trying to maximize the number of viewers they can influence the number of viewers through the following promotional activities or promotional vehicles: direct marketing, pay for clicks, internet advertising, or social media advertising, right? And so we could use some notation, D, P, and S, to represent those different promotional activities. And what we've got in the next column is how effective those are, right? Direct marketing, for each of those ads, 30 viewers per ad. So notice implicitly, I'm not assuming a response function here. I'm not assuming that there's this complicated S-shape response function, but rather I'm assuming a linear response, so that every single direct marketing unit of direct marketing is going to influence 30 views per ad. We've got the audience, we've got the cost of those different types of promotional activities, and there's also, in many cases, some kind of constraint that we face, some kind of natural limit on how much of something we can do. Let's assume that you can only do 30 units of direct marketing, 20 units of pay-per-clicks, and 10 units of social media. We've got a little definition of those down here. And so, one more piece of information. What if this firm, what if your client, they've only got $2,000 to spend on their promotional budget? We talked about how different promotional budgets can be determined if we're trying to model it out, right? We need to know what the level of the promotional budget is, and we know how effective it is, we know how costly it is, and we also know some of the limits on what we have. And so, without looking ahead, see if you can take a few minutes and answer these two questions. What combination of promotional vehicles will maximize the number of viewers? And once you've got that information, how many viewers will this combination produce? We need to add a little bit of terminology. We need to layer on some terminology to our story, right? So what we're looking at is a promotional allocation model. That last slide prompted a promotional allocation story, right? You're trying to figure out how do you maximize the number of viewers given the cost of these different activities, and given you've got some other constraints on how many you can do of each of the different activities, and given your total budget, right? What's the correct combination that's going to maximize the total number of viewers? That we can set that up as a linear optimization model, right? So linear optimization, we're trying to optimize something. Specifically, we're trying to optimize the allocation of the promotional budget across those three different promotional activities or promotional vehicles, D, P, and S, right? To add some terminology to this, so you can think about this, that we've got some inputs and we've got some outputs, right? So the inputs in our linear optimization story, right? We need to know what's called the objective function. The objective function is a function that describes the objective we're trying to achieve. That's a great name for it, right? So in our case, what was the thing that we were trying to do? We were trying to maximize the number of viewers, right? So I'm going to use V for number of viewers. And what influences the number of viewers? Well, there was this measures of effectiveness that we had. It's going to depend on the D, the P, and the S. It's going to depend on how much of those three different types of promotional activity could be done, right? And so we've got our objective function is to maximize the total number of viewers. The total number of viewers is a function of D, P, and S, right? Do you remember? For each unit of D, how many viewers were produced? For each unit of D, there were 30 viewers. So if I go 30 times D, that's going to be a measure of how many viewers I get from all the units of direct marketing. And I can also have these pay-for-clicks, which also produce 30 viewers per unit. And so if I do 30 times P, that's the amount of viewers from that type of promotional activities. And then to finish it out, right, if I do 40 times S, that's the amount of viewers that I'm going to get from my level of social media promotional activities. And the total number of viewers, right, I'm just adding those up. So another way that I can write this story is that the number of viewers was equal to 30D plus 30P plus 40S, right? This is a function, right? It's a function. It depends on my inputs, my dependent variables in my function, or my independent variables in my function, D, P, and S, the amount of promotional activity. That's something that the firm can choose. That's a choice that they can make. We refer to those things as choice variables, right? And those choices determine the level of viewers, and in this case, we're trying to maximize the number of viewers, right? But there's some constraints, right? If we just had this in a world where these three different promotional activities just added more viewers, my goodness, just do infinity amounts of all three of these and you could have infinity viewers, right? Well, why can't you have just a huge number of DP and S? Because all of those three promotional activities cost money, right? Slide back a bit. We've got that in this, right? If we looked at the total amount of money that we spend on direct marketing, right, that would be 30 times D, right? Depending on how much direct marketing we do, each of those units cost $30. So this would tell us the cost of direct marketing. Pay-per-clicks, oops, not 30. I'm looking at the wrong column. Each of those cost $40. And so 40 times D is going to tell me the total amount of money that we have to spend on, not D, P, on pay-per-clicks. And social media, right? Social media is the most effective, but it's also the most costly, right? And so for social media, to find out the total amount we'd spent on social media, how many units of social media advertising do you do times $60 per unit? That would be the total amount of money that's spent on social media. And so we could think about, right, the cost of these things. The total cost of this promotional activities, it was 30D plus 40P plus 60S. This is an equation that describes the total cost of whatever choice of promotional activity you do. And more than that, we know that it can't be more than $2,000, right? So we know that this total cost has to be less than or equal to $2,000. Why? Because that's the promotional budget that our client or our firm came to us with, right? And so we know that all of these things are effective. All of these things are going to get more views, but all of these things cost money and we only have $2,000 to spend, right? So the second line is what we call a constraint. A constraint is some kind of limit that's placed on your choice variables D, P, and S, right? In this case, this constraint came from the promotional budget. We've got three more constraints though, right? Remember this last column was saying, oh my gosh, though, there's a certain amount of these promotional activities that can happen. Direct marketing, you can choose to do some direct marketing. It's got a benefit, it's got a cost with it, but in the maximum, you can only do 30 units of it. How would I write down that constraint? How would I write down the maximum quantity constraint algebraically over here, right? And what we've got is direct marketing, 30 or less. Pay-per-clicks, 20 or less. Social media, 10 or less. So we've got my D has to be less than or equal to 30. My P has to be less than or equal to 20. And my S has to be, oops, wrong direction. S has to be less than or equal to 10, right? So here we go, right? This is my objective function. This is the thing that I'm trying to optimize. In our case, we're trying to maximize the total number of views as a function of these things that we can choose, my choice variables of D, P, and S, but I'm constrained by some things. I'm constrained by the total amount of money that I could spend on these three things, and I'm also constrained by how much I can do of these different activities, right? So this is entirely the setup to a linear optimization problem. So what we can do is we can use the techniques of linear optimization and we can find either the maximized or the minimized objective function, right? So typically the output of a linear optimization process is what we get out of this linear optimization process is we get two things. We get an optimal combination of our choice variables. So usually, right, I'm used to, as an economist, I'm used to using stars to designate optimal values. So I've got a value of D, P, and S that will maximize a value of V. V was the total number of views. D was the D, P, and S are the levels of those different promotional activities, right? So there's also a whole slide, and I wanted to talk through it before we got to this, but I did want to make sure that you had this in your notes. Again, my question is, with these words that describe the problem, are you comfortable with this mathematical representation of those words? Would you feel comfortable seeing these words and coming up with the mathematics, the equations that describe it? And would you also feel comfortable if I gave you some mathematics, being able to put into words what they represent? Or again, let me know if you have any questions about the setup. On the page for this class, there's a file, an Excel file called promotional allocation, right? And it sets up the start of what we need to do in order to implement the linear optimization in Excel. So I think it's nice when you put this in Excel to use some different colors to help highlight the different pieces. We've got 3 different parts that we want to talk about, right? We've got in yellow my decision variables or my choice variables, right? I can use those terms interchangeably. It's a little bit of personal preference where we mean the same thing. So in cell B2, that's going to be the amount of D. D was the direct marketing, right? And so one of the things that I think's nice when you're building a model to represent your objective function and your constraints in Excel, right? You're doing a little bit of spreadsheet modeling. I think it's useful to just put in a value of 1 initially, just so that you can see through with specific values how your model is being built, and so you can verify to make sure that you entered things correctly. So I've got in cells B2, C2, and D2, I've got the level of the decision variables, right? That's one thing, my decision variables. And again, these are the values that we want to know what their optimum values are that are going to maximize the total number of views. In green, I've got my objective function, right? My objective function has the total number of viewers, right? And so again, we've got an equation that describes what the objective function is. The objective function was looking at the level of D, P, and S based on their effectiveness, right? And so we've got also these level of effectiveness, 30, 30, and 40. Again, if you go back a slide, do you remember where the 30, 30, and 40 come from? And then the objective function is telling the total number of views. So again, the total number of views, I'm going to do a little bit of spreadsheet modeling. We've got the amount of D times how effective D is, plus the amount of P times how effective P was. And then we've got the amount of S and how effective the S was, right? And so again, remember that I set just to see how this formula works, I've set DP and S equal to 1, so I'm guessing this number is going to be 100, and it is, right? And again, we can just verify a few things about the model. If we increase D by 1 from 1 to 2, I think it's going to go up by 30. It did, right? And so again, that's just to check to make sure that your objective function has been set up correctly. So 2 of the 3 main pieces that we need to focus on. We've got our decision variables. Those are the things that we can control. We've got the objective function. That's the thing that we're trying to maximize. If you wanted, you could even include a little reminder to yourself that what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the number of viewers, right? Sometimes we might be looking at an optimization problem that's a minimization problem, right? If we're thinking about how to produce a certain thing from a supply chain perspective, hey, our objective is not trying to maximize costs, it's trying to minimize costs. So again, the framework that we're using can be easily applied to that other form of optimization, the minimization, but right here, what we're doing is we're maximizing. We've got our decision variables, we've got our objective functions, and we've got some constraints. We've got some limits that are placed on our situation. The first constraint that we're going to look at is that budget constraint, right? That promotional activities budget constraint. We only had $2,000 to spend, right? So this is a value that is a constant, right? If you look up here, this is not a function. This is a value. It's a fixed amount. What we want to do is we want to have right here the value of the total amount that we would spend if we bought or if we used those 3 different types of promotional activities, right? I had to go back and remind myself what the different costs were. I had forgotten them for a second. But we've got, so for D, each unit of D costs $30, each unit of P costs $40, each unit of S costs $60. So right here, can we build a little equation, a little model that describes the total cost, which must be below 2,000, right? So what we've got is we've got this value times this value, right? The amount of D times the cost of D plus How much money are we going to spend on P? Well, how much P do we buy? How much does each unit of P cost? And then, how much do we spend on S? Or how many units of S do we buy times the price of S? And so, yep, at $30, $40, and $60, when we buy 1 unit of each of those, it costs $130. And so again, we could say, what if, just to check our model, if we increase the value of P from 1 to 2, I think that value is going to go up by $40 to 170, and it did, right? It's perfect, right? And so this is a little bit of the tension, right? We can look at the tension between these two different pieces of information here, right? If we're going to use one more unit of D, it's going to make the number of viewers go up, but it's also going to eat up some of our promotional budget. So if I increase that to 2, notice what happens to the number of viewers and the what happens to the total cost. Both of those went up. I was getting more viewers, but I was also spending more money. What's the right way to spend my money? That's what the objective function, or what the linear optimization is trying to do. So we've got this thing, right? So we've got, this is the total cost, and it has to be below 2,000. What were the other 3 constraints? It was that D, P, and S had to be respectively below 30, 20, and 10, right? So I can pretty easily do this. This is just the amount of D that we're using, right? And it has to be below 30. So again, right, we build a nice little model so that when I change the amount of D, it's going to change both the cost and it's going to eat up one of those 30 units that I could use on D. Notice real quick, as a little thought experiment, what if I decided to max that out? If I maxed it out and I used all 30 values of D that are possible, I've got a lot more viewers than just 1 unit of D, obviously, but I haven't used all my money yet. Right? What was the maximum number of P that I could use, right? I could use 20, and so I want to highlight the value of P. What if I maxed out the amount of P that I used? I've got more viewers than when I had 1P, not surprised. I still haven't maxed out my money, right? How about social media, right? I can use, at a maximum, 10 units of whatever's here. Right? This is, I referenced the D2, which is the amount of social media. If I tried to use all 10 units, I do not have enough money to buy that much, right? This is fundamentally why it's an optimization problem, right? Is I've got this constraint of $2,000 that I can spend. I've got some limits on what I can buy in terms of D, P, and S, but I cannot afford all 3 at their maximum value. So what's the right combination of D, P, and S that's going to maximize the number of viewers, right? Notice, right, when I reduce the amount of D to 29, I don't get as many viewers, and I had a decrease in the total amount of money spent. If I decrease the amount of P by 1 unit, again, less viewers, getting closer to my budget. What's the right combination of D, P, and S that will maximize the number of viewers, keep me under budget, and also not violate these restrictions on the total amount that I can do? Again, let's reset it to 1, 1, 1. And I've got my 3 constraints right there. Okay. How do I implement linear optimization in Excel? Under Data. You should, if not, go under your, under File, Options, Add-ins, Go. If you don't already have this clicked, click it. I had it clicked, and I think we had done this earlier in the semester, but in case you had missed it, this is where we're going to use the solver. This allows you to do optimal values. So go ahead and open up Solver, and we want to talk through what this looks like, right? So it's got some stuff in it. Okay, so this dialog box under the solver has a couple of different pieces that we want to highlight. There are 3 main ones that should automatically jump to your attention. Number 1, set objective. Number 2, changing variable cells. And number 3, subject to the constraints. This is the 3 main things that we were talking about earlier, right? We've got in Excel, we had set this model up, this spreadsheet model, with our decision variables, the things that we could change. Sometimes they get referred to as the choice variables. And those choice variables impact the objective. And there's also some constraints on our decision variables. That absolutely, those three pieces are the main things that we want to think about with this. So our objective, where is the cell that includes the value of our objective function? Boom. Right, that's B7. And then right below that, this is probably not one of the top three things, but it's number 4, is what do you want to do with that value, in this case, the number of viewers? Do you want to maximize it? Do you want to minimize it? Or do you want to achieve a certain value, right? And we can adjust this. We want to maximize it, right? How do we maximize the number of viewers? We maximize the number of viewers by choosing or by changing the values of your choice variables, which are located in B2, C2, D2, right? And so that's the Excel notation that tells us of that. This is a little bit more complicated, this third piece, in order to do the constraints, right? There's nothing in the constraints. What I have to do is I have to individually add each of those constraints, right? But notice I can add, I can change, I can delete, I can do a bunch of stuff. We can add, the first constraint was the budget constraint. So I'm going to put a cell reference that is the cell that references the cells that have my decision variables, right? So that's all complicated to say. I want to put E10 there because remember, E10 was the value that would change when I changed the values of D, P, and S in B2, C2, and D2, right? And that value in E2 has to be less than or equal to, and notice as a quick drop down, I can do a bunch of different things related to it, but it's less than or equal to this constant value that I have, 2000 here. What I could do is I could do this one of two ways, right? I could either reference the cell that has the number 2000 written in it, or I can actually write out the number 2000, not 20,000, but 2000, right? So if I were to type out this constraint as the number 2000, then if your client comes back and says, actually, we're going to raise our budget to 2500, right? If they're going to change one of those constraints, I would have to go back into this constraint. Whereas if I just referenced the cell, then I could just change the value in the cell to do it. So, yep, I want to do the value of the cell. And then I hit add, and they just, what just happened is they were added to the dialog box, but it gives me the options of adding additional ones. So again, right, we're just going to go ahead and add each of these constraints. You can slow this down and pause it if you have any questions, but I think it's pretty straightforward. The only thing that's a little bit complicated is on this last constraint. Once I've entered the information from my last constraint, rather than adding it, click OK. And what it's going to do is it's going to put all 4 of those constraints in there. So I've got my objective, I've got my decision variables, and I've got my constraints. Okay, the other thing that jumps out as for this level class, what we want to do real quick is by selecting a solving method, right? And so what I've found is that occasionally, if you write a nonlinear functional form, the simple version might hiccup a little bit and give you some values that aren't correct. And so I don't use Excel a lot in my research for optimization. I use different mathematical software tools. But when I do some of the basic stuff in Excel, I found that doing nonlinear it gets you to the same thing. Click solve. And what happened, right? So you can go ahead and, if you want, you can look at these different items, but really, everything that you need to know has now been updated. Notice, what did Excel do? As soon as we clicked solve, Excel changed these 3 values. They changed them to their optimal values. So, right? So I would call those are now represent D, P, and S star, that value of 30 units of D, 20 units of P, and 5 units of S. That combination maximizes the number of viewers. And we can check this, right? What if we tried to increase the number of D at the expense of P? We have the same number of viewers, but down here, we haven't spent all of our money, right? So instead, 30, 20. Now we've spent all our money. We have the same number of, I see why it's doing it, because they have the same level of effectiveness, but this one is more, wait a minute, what was I trying to do? Could I do 31 units of D and 19 units? I was going to say, why isn't this optimal? I get the same number of views, and I'm not quite spending as much money. Why can't I do that combination? Because it's violating constraint number 2, right? No. Your D's can only be 30, right? D's can be 30, P maxed out at 20, and we've got some S left over, right? When we again, we looked at this earlier, but when we max out the D and the P, we've still got some money that we can spend on S. And so for our S, how many units of S can we do before we have spent all our money? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That fifth unit is what we can buy, maxing out our budget, and that is the way to get our maximum number of viewers, right? As an economist, I want to point out one quick thing about this, right? So what I've got right here with these three values are the price or the cost of those different promotional activities. And what I have right here is how effective they are, right? So what I want to do real quick is I want to calculate how effective they are divided by the price of each of them. And if I do that, and I need to add some decimals in order to see exactly what I've got going on, if I take that amount and I pull it, I'm not going to pull it, I'm going to copy it to the right, I've got these different values. And so real quick, again, think about what's in your numerator, think about what's in your denominator. What are the units of this value 1.00? The reason why I like thinking of it this way as an economist is this is really, right, the bang for the buck, right? This is looking at how effective something is per dollar spent, right? And so this is a measure of the bang for the buck. And so if earlier you might have, when I asked you to try to think about this problem on your own, this might have been a way that you tried to solve it. Usually I've got about a third to half of the class. This is the values that they do just intuitively, right? What they're doing is they calculate the bang for the buck and say, where do you want to spend your money first? What you'd want to do first is you'd want to spend your money first on the thing that's most effective per dollar spent, which is your D. And how much D can you buy? Well, you can only buy 30 units. After you've spent all your money on D, where's the next place that you should spend your money? P has a better bang for the buck than S, and so spend your money on P, but you can only buy so much P. So after you've maxed out the amount of P that you can buy, then where's the last place that you should spend your money? It's on S, right? And your S is your social media. It has the lowest bang for the buck, but you've still got some money left over, so go ahead and buy some units, and you can purchase 5 of those units until you have spent all of your money, right? Intuitively, that's what Excel is doing in the background, but what you may find, right, if you're doing a big, complicated supply chain model, your spreadsheet might have many, many different parts to it. You might not be able to quite easily do this kind of calculation in your head. In that case, right, that solver is your friend for trying to find those optimal values. Another example of what we can look at, right, and I'm an economist, so a little biased with my examples, right, but we can think about a basic model for profit maximization, right? And so we could think about a firm in a perfectly competitive market. In a perfectly competitive market, each firm is small and insignificant. They don't have any kind of power to influence market price. And so each unit that they sell for $40, right? So the price of every single unit is $40, meaning that the revenue coming into the company is $40 per unit sold. Let's use Q to represent units in this story, right? And so implicitly, let's assume that every unit that is produced, we're able to turn around and sell on the market. And so this is the way that we generate the revenue in the market, right? Firms get to choose the amount of Q that they do in order to maximize profit. So why don't they sell just an infinite amount? Because each of those units cost money, right? And so what the objective of a firm is to maximize profit. Profit is the difference between revenue and costs, TRTC, for total revenue, total costs, right? We talked briefly about how revenue is generated. How about cost, right? And again, total revenue is price times quantity, or in this case, the price is 40, so 40 times Q. And then costs, where do costs come from? All costs fall into 2 categories. They're either fixed or variable costs, right? Fixed costs are costs that are just a constant amount regardless of how much is produced. Let's assume that fixed costs are equal to $600. And then variable costs are those costs that change based on how much you produced. Variable costs are a function of the quantity that is produced. And so I've got some equation that's a function of Q to describe VC, but FC plus VC equals TC. Total costs are equal to the fixed cost plus the variable costs. And if I took the revenue and subtracted the total cost, what I'm left with is the profit. And the goal of a firm in a perfectly competitive market is to choose the amount of Q so that profit is maximized, right? Three parts to the story: objective function, decision variables, constraints. Real quick, what is the objective? What is the decision, or what are the decision variables? What are the constraints for the setup of this problem? I want to hop back over to Excel, but I want to ask you, could you come up with, in Excel, how to input those equations, or those words, that story, and it was a mix of words and equations, into Excel, into that framework of decision variables, the objective function, and the constraints. So, decision variables. Hopefully it was pretty obvious. What's the choice of the firm? What they get to choose is they get to choose the quantity they produce. And so, yep, Q is going to be the choice variable, right? I said plural, but there was only one choice variable. The only thing they get to choose is the number of units they produce. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take profit, and they are trying to, we can remind ourselves, they're trying to maximize this value, right? And so what I need here is I need here to be profit. So there's two ways that I could do that. Number one, I could start writing an equation and incorporate all the information right here about total revenue, fixed and variable costs, and have that be my profit. But oftentimes, especially in an accounting framework, you might be dealing with a spreadsheet that has the information in multiple places. So let's lay out the different parts of the story. We've got total revenue. We've got total cost. That's an important part of it. And what I know for my profit is that my profit has to be the total revenue minus the total cost, right? What I also have is I've got fixed costs and I've got variable costs. So I've got my total costs are equal to my fixed costs plus my variable costs. And do I remember what the fixed costs were? I believe they were 600, right? And then if I just enter the fixed costs, notice what happened in my model, right? When I entered the fixed costs, I don't have anything for variable costs yet, and so my total costs were just these value of fixed costs, and I don't have anything for revenue, so my profit is just zero revenue minus costs, which are my fixed costs, so I'm losing $600, right? I need to include an equation to describe variable costs. Real quick, go back and let's review what that value is. Variable costs are a function of Q, right? And so look back in your notes and you've got, it was 10Q. In cell B2, I've got the value that Q takes on, right? So 10 times B2 is going to be the first part of that, plus, and that's 0.125 times the value of Q in B2 squared, right? When I've got one single unit produced, variable costs are $10. $600 of fixed cost plus this 10.125 equals total cost of $610.12, right? And notice when I increase Q, notice the values that change. As I increase Q, what happens to the value of fixed costs? Stays the same, right? But as I increase Q, the value of variable costs goes up. And notice that it does not go up at a constant rate, right? Notice from the jump from 9 to 10 is a $12 jump, but from 10 to 11, it's a little bit more than $12, right? And so this is not a linear relationship with your variable costs. Again, your variable had that squared component. How about revenue, right? We're missing story about the revenue. Total revenue is equal to, you remember how that was calculated? Total revenue is price times quantity. As a little reminder, that's what it is, right? You could even include some reminders of this. Fixed costs plus variable costs. Total revenue. Do I have the price anywhere? I need to add that piece of information, right? Let's add prices way down here. And prices, if you recall, were $40. Total revenue is the value of price times the amount of quantity. Oof, I was wondering, why is that number so big? Because my Q was not set to 1 anymore, right? If I default start with Q equals 1, the total revenue is $40. And this is a firm in a perfectly competitive market. So if instead they produce and sell 2 units, $80 of total revenue, 3 units, 120, right? Each unit, they always sell for $40 because they're small and insignificant in a perfectly competitive market, right? So, boy, But notice what happened to profit. Profit was finally, and again, notice the cells that are being referenced, is taking the total revenue minus the total cost, right? If this firm sold 1 unit, they'd lose $570. If they sold 2 units, they would lose less money, right? And so you could think about, what if they did 30 units? Oh, suddenly their profit is positive. What if they do 45 units? Even bigger, right? What if we do 60 units? Even larger. Let's go ahead and do 90 units. Even larger. How about 120 units? Even larger. How about 160 units? Wait, what? What happened? Going from 120 to 160 units, what happened to the profitability? The revenue went up, right? Check out the revenue from 160 compared to 120. The total revenue went up, but also notice what happened to the cost, right? For the 160 units, total costs went up by more than the increase in revenue, and so that actually pushed the profit back down, right? And so if you were going to try to graph out profitability, it would start at 0 and it would have an upside down bowl shape, right? It's going to be an upside down U-shaped that's generated from the quadratic variable cost equation, right? And so the question is, what's the value of Q that's going to maximize profit? We've got everything we need. I've got one more section here though, right? Remember, constraints? Haha, this was a bit of a trick question earlier. Are there any constraints in this variable? No, right? There is nothing that's preventing this firm from producing as much Q as they want. There is no constraint on Q. But as they produce more Q, it is going to make costs go up, and so that's not going to increase their objective function. But there's no constraint on the value that Q can take. The firm could produce 300 units if they wanted. Their profit's negative. They're not going to want to do that, but there's no constraint stopping them from doing that. Okay, so we've got all the pieces. And again, I want to pause and ask the question, do you feel okay with the words that we had talking through the example and how we could set this up in Excel? I got excited and I jumped ahead of myself. What do we need to do? Under the data, the solver tab, right? We got to fill in the pieces. We've got the objective, choice variables, decision variables, constraints. What's the objective, right? Your objective is to maximize profit. So we're trying to minimize, but no, not minimize, but maximize profit. By, what's the choice variable? In that case, that's what's in B2. Do we have any constraints? We have no constraints, right? In this case, we can illustrate one other thing. Make the unconstrained variables non-negative, right? So what are my variables again? That's my decision variable, right? Does it make sense for Q to be negative 400? Can a firm produce negative 400 units? No, they can't, right? So but can Q be 0? Sure it can, right? And so checking or unchecking this box is just a way to make the unconstrained variables non-negative. I mean, it's got to be 0 or a positive values. It can't be negative, right? For the most part, for our applications, what we're looking at, we're not going to get non-negative optimal values, and so it's not going to matter that much. But I did want to highlight that that is what it is. All right, so let's go ahead and click solve. And remember, when I click the solve button, what should be happening? That Q should change to the optimal value. And sometimes you got to use your common sense. It's doing just a little bit of rounding up to 120, right? But the way that the optimization algorithm that Excel uses, notice it is not finding an exact solution to this. Rather, what it's doing is an approximation based on a grid search of different variations on the variables. And so you might get this occasionally. Use your common sense. This is 120, right? And again, notice, if we have 120, what's the level of profit? It is 1,200. Go ahead and change the value of Q up 1 and down 1, right? So what if instead they produced 1 less unit, 119? Watch what happens to the profitability. Got a little bit lower. What if instead of doing 120, they did 121? What would happen to the level of profit? Got a little bit lower, right? 120 is the value that maximizes profit, right? And so that's great. But what's also nice about the setup to this is the reason why I typed all of these values out. What if prices go up to $45, right? All I need to do is just change that value, and I can go back into my solver, hit the solve button, and what's it doing? Now it's telling me it's 140 is going to be the optimal value, right? Or what if the variable costs, what if instead of being scaled by 10, what if they were scaled by 20? Now think about this. Higher costs mean a firm should produce less, and so when I redo my solver, my optimal Q should be a smaller number than the 140. Yep, and it was. It went all the way down to 199, right? 199. 100, right? Yeah, 100. One other thing that I want to point out, and again, this is not an economics class, it's not a marketing class, it's an analytics class, but what if the fixed costs go up to 800? If you've taken your economics class, you might be anticipating this. Yep, what happened to the amount that the firm should produce to maximize profit? Fixed costs have no impact on the amount that the firm should produce to maximize profit. If you're paying close attention, you will notice that that did reduce profitability, but it didn't change the quantity that the firm should produce to maximize profit. And again, if you've taken your economics class, maybe you might understand why that's true. If not, no big deal. The main thing was, do you feel comfortable with this setup, implementing it in Excel? One more example to consider. Let's consider utility maximization. Again, I'm just pulling other examples of this linear optimization. So utility, for our purposes, we can think about that as satisfaction. An individual maximizes their utility function that has diminishing marginal utility. All that means is that, right, we've got two things that make people happy. We've got B for the number of books and Z for the number of trips to the zoo, right? So diminishing marginal utility simply means if we look at the amount of books that people have, more books are going to make you happier, but at a diminishing rate. So your utility, your happiness, might look something like this, right? Whereas the first few books really make you happy, but as you get more and more and more books, they make you happier, but at a diminishing rate. Same thing with trips to the zoo. That first trip to the zoo, big jump in your happiness or your utility. But the more and more trips you take to the zoo, the less and less happy it's going to make you, right? Both of those things, B and Z, both of those bring your utility, right? So your utility is a function of how much B you have and how much Z you have. I need to posit a utility function, right? I realize that this example does not have a functional form. Let's assume that utility is equal to 10 times B to the 0.5 power, not F, sorry, B to the 0.5 power Z to the 0.5 power, right? And so those exponents of 0.5 on the utility function are going to give it this nice little shape. What I'm doing here is I'm introducing a nonlinearity into the objective function. A little bit different than what we had before, right? And the price of books, let's assume that books cost $5 and a trip to the zoo is $12.50, right? Trips to the zoo clearly are going to be more expensive, but they might also give you more utility. Yeah, let's have them give you more utility. So let's actually, I lied, let's adjust 0.25 for the books and 0.75 for the zoo. Zoos are going to make you happier than books, but trips to the zoo are going to make you happier, but they're also more expensive. Books don't make you quite as happy, but they're also cheaper. So what's the right way to spend your money, right? And then again, let's assume that you've got $300 to spend on books or zoo trips, and then you've only got 10 possible trips that you can possibly take to the zoo. There's no limit on the amount of books that you can buy, but there's a limit on how many trips to the zoo that you can do. You can only go 10 times. So I like thinking about this as like my daughter's utility function, and during the summer she can either do books or she can do trips to the zoo, but we can only go to the zoo so many times. What's the right way? What's the right combination of trips to the zoo and books that can maximize utility? So given all this that we've just said, can we open up Excel and design this in Excel? Okay, so we've got 3 different parts to focus on. What do you have choice over? You have a choice over how many books and how much zoo. That's what's going to be in cells B2 and C2 for the amount of books and the amount of zoo. And again, to build my model, put a 1 there just as a starting point. What's the objective? What are we trying to do? We're trying to maximize utility. And so I can just directly enter this utility function of 10 times books raised to the 0.25 power times trips to the zoo raised to the 0.75 power, right? And again, so we can think about with one of each, your level of utility is 10. Higher values represent greater satisfaction. What do you do if you get one more book? Oh, sorry, you get one more book, so going from 1 to 2, your utility goes up, right? It went up to 11.98, but notice if you had one more trip to the zoo, your utility goes up a whole lot more. Everybody likes the zoo more than books, right? But also notice we can do, so look at the rate of change, right? A second trip to the zoo, your utility jumped by 6.8. A third trip to the zoo, your utility jumped by less, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth, and a 10th. Let's do 10, 56, 11, down to 60, right? That jump in the amount of Z got smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Let's go ahead and set it back to 1. We've got two other things we want to do. 300. What's the 300 related to in terms of the constraint? That's the total amount of money that we had. Oh boy, how much did each of these things cost? I think it was 5 and 12.50, right? Yes, 5 and 12.50. So the total amount of money spent on books is the $5 times the $5 per book times the number of books plus the $12.50 on a trip to the zoo times how many trips to the zoo there were. That's the total amount of money that was spent. And the other constraint that we had is you can only go to the zoo 10 times. 10 times or less, right? So again, those are my constraints. I've got my constraints, I've got my objective function, my maximizing utility, and I got my decision variables of Z and B. And so if we real quick just pull up Solver, again, do you feel comfortable using this dialog box? The objective was, oops, wrong cell, B7. That's where I'm maximizing utility. I maximize utility by choosing B and Z, and I have two constraints. This total cost has to be less than the $300 I give my daughter every summer to spend on stuff. And 1, which was the number of trips to the zoo, had to be less than 10. Right? And go ahead and click solve. And what do you find? Right? So what you notice is, maybe this is a surprise, maybe it's not, zoos are really fun, right? The amount that your utility increased for a trip to the zoo was way higher than the amount your utility increased for the amount of books. And so yeah, zoos are more expensive, but it's where you want to spend your money first. And actually what you end up doing is you end up maximizing out the total amount of money that you spent on the zoos. And you, so you buy the 10 trips to the zoo, and you can do 35 books. So again, these are the optimal combinations of B and Z that you would use to maximize your utility. And we can even go ahead and say, yep, what if we did one less? We'd have lower utility. One less, a lot lower utility, right? That's it. That's just how to implement these linear optimization problems in Excel.